Thanks very much for taking the time to join us this morning. So this is the latest Brainovation Network clinical round, elevating your clinical practice with research, a how-to guide. Our presenter today is Sonia Brodie. She's our Vice President of Clinical Research at the Center for Neurological Studies, and that's a division of Health Tech Connects. And so over to you, Sonia.
Okay, thanks, Patty. So we've got a small crowd today, so by all means, this does not have to be a formal slide-by-slide presentation. I'll start, but I'm very open to just discussion and questions as we go. Pull up my slides. Is that good? Okay. So I figured I would divide this talk into three parts. First, I'll just tell you who I am and what business I have talking about this topic, what the Center for Neurology Studies is, and just like what is research generally. Secondly, I'll talk more about how to get involved in research that's going on already. And then third, it will be kind of the more step-by-step how-to guide of how to do your own research. So first, introductions. This is me. My background is in neuroscience. I've actually spent about 16 years in brain research of various sorts. Started in rat research, then moved on to humans, and I like humans better. I did a lot of work in devices, now doing more work in drugs and psychedelics. But really, like the common underlying theme of my career to date has been finding new ways to improve brain health and mental health through clinical research. And as you probably have heard before, so Health Tech Connects, our parent company, operates as a flywheel. So we have a measurement device called the NeuroCatch, which measures how your brain works. We have the Center for Neurology Studies, which is our clinical research team. And then we have the Surrey Neuroplasticity Clinic, which is the clinic that ties it all together and implements the treatments that we test and the measurement tool that we have. So all three of those kind of complement each other synergistically, and momentum in one helps feed momentum in another one. And what I'm talking more about today is the Center for Neurology Studies. So that's the test part of the measure, test, treat flywheel. So the CNS is a site for trials in medical devices, digital health platforms, pharmaceuticals, psychedelic assisted therapies. We also do contract research services to help other people do research. And we focus on the same therapeutic areas that NeuroCatch focuses on. So concussion and brain injury, dementia and neurological disease, PTSD and mental health, and brain performance and human optimization. So really you could think of our services, our research services in two camps. One is I have an idea and I'd like to do a study. So that could be I've never done research before, or I've done lots of research, but I don't have time to dedicate to the nuances of protocol development, stats plans, clinical monitoring, and all of that. Or on the flip side, I have a study and I'm looking for a site. So if you're kind of more of an established company, you've got your developed protocol and you need the patients and the data to fill your studies and get the data that you need. That's our other division where we can help. So just to give you a better idea of the kinds of projects we do, a lot of our business right now is focused on psychedelic assisted therapies. So you can see the room in the top right is one of our dosing rooms. We're working on 2 studies with psilocybin mushrooms, a full dose, 8 hours spent in that room, either on a placebo or using psilocybin with the presence of 2 therapists. Or another study coming up is with DMT, a different psychedelic substance. And that one's focusing on treatment-resistant depression. We're doing 3 different studies with migraines. One of them we're looking at an existing drug in the emergency room. We're doing some post-market research as well in migraine drugs. If you've heard of the Immortal Chamber before, we have an Immortal Chamber. This is a very fancy kind of multimodal stimulation device that we just got into our clinic. It's a combination of red light therapy, pulsed electromagnetic stimulation, oxygen, vibrations, and acoustics. And really, they're throwing all they can at you, but we're trying to get a measurement of like, what is that actually doing to your physiology? So that's the study that we're doing. And then with our own flagship product, the NeuroCatch platform, having our own in-house clinical research team means that when we develop new features, we test them right away. We're increasing the size of our reference range. So like, what does your brain look like when you're 6 versus 96? So right now we're running over 800 scans, kind of building out that reference so that you can really compare to exactly someone of your age and gender. And then other clinical validation work, so using the NeuroCatch in acute concussion and chronic concussion and dementia, neurologic disease, and other clinical populations. So I want to step back a little bit more and just say generally, this is a presentation about research. So what does research mean? I looked at a bunch of definitions online and kind of the things that tie it together. One is that it's systematic. So you're kind of following a process. And then it can be an investigation or experimentation. So you might just be looking at something that exists already, or you might actually be manipulating an environment and introducing something new to a person or to a situation to see what happens when you change something. And then the goal is to discover information, either new information or existing information that you haven't found yet, or to reach a new understanding or an understanding of something that you don't fully understand yet. So it's a pretty flexible term, and there's lots of different kinds of studies that you can do. Before anything comes into the clinical space, there's a lot of preclinical work that needs to be done with in vitro models, animal models, bench testing, and then in vivo models. There's kind of exploratory pilot studies, feasibility studies, safety studies, proof of concept studies, investigator-initiated studies, and then you can get into whether or not you're describing something that exists or analyzing something by manipulating the environment. So surveys or descriptive research, experimental research, either randomizing or just observing different groups as they're exposed to different things. You can look at data retrospectively, kind of looking backwards in time on what happened, or prospectively, where you start the study and then watch what happens afterwards. So it really depends on what kinds of questions you're looking to answer, will dictate what type of study you're going to be running. And then the word evidence. So like, how do we know whether or not something is truly effective? It comes in a lot of different qualities as well. So expert opinion, kind of our base layer. If someone who knows what they're talking about tells you something, you know, if you go to your doctor's office and they give you an expert opinion, we believe them most of the time. Next level up is a case report or a case series. So a case report is like, well, I had this one patient with Parkinson's disease and we tried PONS therapy and they had good results. One case, one time, you can publish that and put it out into the world, but it's still an N of one. A case series is like, we had 3 patients or we had 5 patients, and you're kind of just describing what happened of a common series of cases. Next up from that would be case control studies. So we've had 10 patients with Parkinson's in the last year. 5 went through PONS therapy, 5 did not, and it seems like the people who got PONS therapy did better. This is not true facts. These are just examples of study designs. Cohort studies would be either putting people into groups and kind of looking at kind of a broader, there was a group that went through an exercise therapy and a group that went through an exercise therapy with stimulation, and how did they do? Randomized controlled trials, this is kind of more getting into like a prospective design at this point. So saying, starting today, when you enroll in the study, we will randomly decide what treatment you get, and we will look out the other side. And that can be either placebo-controlled.
Sorry, I lost your audio for a second there, and I wasn't sure if it was you or me.
Okay, all good. So randomized controlled trials can be placebo-controlled, where you either get the treatment or you don't. They can be active placebo-controlled, where your placebo is something like exercise rather than nothing, so you're still getting some sort of treatment. It can be blinded, where nobody knows what you're taking. So in our psychedelic trials, for example, you take a pill, and you don't know if you're going to have a psilocybin experience or you've just taken a sugar pill and you're going to spend 8 hours wondering if you've taken a psychedelic all day. Once there's kind of a body of published work around a particular topic, The next level up is a systematic review, where someone, as the title implies, systematically goes through everything that's been published and starts to look at, just describe the overall trends with multiple publications. And then kind of the top of that is a meta-analysis, which is even more systematic than a systematic review, where you can actually pool data from different high-quality studies and look at bigger statistics and bigger data pools to come to a broader conclusion about whether something is actually truly safe and effective. So there's lots of ways of knowing, and at the end of the day, the meta-analysis is what informs the expert opinion at the bottom, and then off we go again. Obviously, not everyone has the full capacity to do randomized controlled trials and above. It's a pretty specialized skill set. It's really expensive and time consuming, but there's definitely value in doing some of these lower level but still important building blocks to feed into the bigger studies that end up getting done. So my message to you as clinicians today is that as clinicians, you look at what evidence exists and you use that to inform your practice. But also as you practice, and perhaps you're doing your own little experiments and trying things out, you are generating your own new evidence to inform future practice. So you, even in like very small scale, you might have a hypothesis, like, I think this supplement might work for this patient, even though we don't actually know for sure if this supplement will work for all patients with this condition. And then if it works, you've learned something and that informs your future practice. So you're kind of, everyone's doing a little bit of research all the time, and it's just how systematic you get and how much you translate that knowledge as to whether or not other people get to benefit from it. So why should you do research? As a clinician, you have some of the best experience. You get to see all the weird stuff with your clients. So whatever it says in all the published papers, if you try it in the real world, it might not go the way the literature says that it will. Or you see clients with multiple comorbidities, and often in clinical studies, we pick the clients who don't have multiple comorbidities. People with mental health combined with physical health conditions, and all these different things that play into the real world. So you are generating really good questions and really good evidence all the time. When you're doing research in your practice, your clients get access to cutting edge treatments that they would otherwise have to wait until they're fully approved and adopted before they can get access to. Your practice becomes even more evidence-based, so you're kind of constantly learning and improving and bringing that fresh new evidence into your practice. And as a clinician, you get to expand your professional skill set, so you're learning more than just how to be a good clinician. You also start to learn how to be a good researcher. So second chapter, there's a lot of research that's happening already in this world. So you don't have to start from scratch necessarily. So how might you get involved in existing research, and how to make it a win-win for everybody involved? So first I'll just talk a little bit about academic trials. We have a lot of institutions all across the world, really, filled with brilliant academics with amazing research questions, and they're professional researchers. They're doing this all the time. The thing is that they need access to patients. In order to say anything about a certain population, they need access to those patients. So a win for them is partnering with a clinician like you, where you have the patients and you've got the curiosity and the willingness to engage, and then they get access to your patients who can benefit from the research. So working with an academic is good for you because they do this professionally. This is not their first time doing research. They're constantly doing research. So they're experienced and they'll give you a really good mentorship. Academics are often very good at finding funding. This is kind of the hustle of a professor or a professional researcher, is that they're constantly applying for grants. They know the deadlines, they know the major programs, and they can usually just rattle off all the applications that they have outstanding and the ones that are coming up in the next 3 years. Also, academics have grad students, and grad students are eager beavers that are super excited to get involved and do a lot of the grunt work of research for you. So that could be grant applications, protocol development, ethics applications, data collection, recruitment activities, manuscript writing, statistics, kind of all the challenging parts, grad students love to do that work, and that helps them get their degree. So when you're working with academics, usually you get access to that either free or very cheap labor that's enthusiastically willing to help you. On the other hand, there's also industry-sponsored trials happening all the time. So this could be anything from a small tech startup to a really big pharma trial, like a vaccine trial for AstraZeneca with the next iteration of COVID. So the win for industry really, again, so they need access to your patients. But in this case, they're also often looking for subject matter expertise and just like the physical space and team to collect the data for them. The wins for you when you work with industry is most of the time they bring their own funding. So when you get a contract with industry, they just pay you to do the research. You don't have to write a grant. You don't have to go hustling and asking for money. They just give it to you. Your patients get access to the newest treatments. So often by the time it's coming into the patient population, it's been through many rounds of preclinical and pilot and feasibility and dose finding and safety studies. So you can proceed with a general sense of confidence that this is a worthwhile treatment to consider for your patients. And often patients are looking for something new that they don't have access to already. And then a lot of sponsors out there, especially the bigger pharma companies, have a portfolio of products in their clinical pipeline. So if you do really good on one study, that will often bring in more studies for you in the future. So build a good relationship with your sponsor company and you'll kind of keep getting to do more research with them. So I'll just kind of give you a peek into my world, a little bit of like how these larger scale industry sponsored trials happen. So this would be, picture big pharma. We'll imagine Pfizer as an example. So there's a sponsor out there, call it Pfizer, with a new product, like a new vaccine, and they hire a contract research organization or a CRO to facilitate their study. They don't always, sometimes they do it in-house, but as a generalization, let's say that that's the way it goes. Together, the sponsor and the CRO decide on their countries and regions of interest. So they might say, the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, because we want access to like this particular population. And then regions of interest, they'll say often like we want at least 3 in Ontario because there's lots of people in Ontario. We want people in Hawaii because we want Pacific Islander populations. There is a big focus on diversity. So they kind of try, in one way, they're trying to make sure that their population matches the demographic. So we don't want too many of one race from one country and another race from another country, but we do want sites to be recruiting a diverse population. So once they've decided, okay, Canada is a country of interest and Western Canada, good news for me, is a region of interest, then they send out some feasibility analyses. So they'll send out more feasibility analyses than sites they're actually planning on selecting. And you kind of have to bid at this point and say, I think we could do this study. So your contract research organization selects their sites based on feasibility analysis. So you say, we have lots of patients with Parkinson's disease or lots of access to healthy adults who would be willing to volunteer for a vaccine study. We have this investigator, we have this, this is what's good about our site. And then if they select you, then you're awarded the contract, you negotiate, and then you get to conduct the study. Often enrollment is competitive. So maybe they'll say you get 10 spots. And if you can fill those 10 spots fast, we'll give you another 10. And they'll actually take potential spots away from other sites if you're a fast enroller. Ultimately, all the sites around the world are working together to fill the study as fast as possible. But if one site is performing better than another, then that site's going to get more patients in. Once all of that is done, the site just sends the data back to the sponsor for analysis. Usually they'll have like a third-party company that does the analysis so that it's totally unbiased and they follow the plan. And then from there, this is the honest truth, you may see some really high impact publications, you may see some products go to market, and that's the best. Amazing to see, but like sometimes research doesn't always work out the way you think, and it's a quiet failure. Like sometimes their results are insignificant, they don't publish, and you just never hear anything about it again. And that's the way it goes. So if you're a new site looking to catch the eye of a sponsor, here are some like general things that they're looking for, and this is quite nuanced and really relationship based. But as I mentioned, relevant geography. So for me, I'm saying you might not have as many sites in Western Canada as you do in Eastern Canada. So we can help kind of spread out your catchment area across the country. Access to eligible patients. We have a database of this many patients with this condition. Big focus on diversity. So our site is located in Surrey. I say Surrey has a huge South Asian population, and Vancouver generally has a big Asian population. So that kind of helps diversify us from some of the other sites that might be considered. They are interested in your research team and investigator experience. We've found in the past, we will often contract investigators who don't have a lot of experience with research. As long as you have an experienced research team that's kind of wrapped around the investigator, that's okay. They'll still kind of see that as capable of running the study. So that's an important note, and something that I want to encourage everyone to think about is outsourcing your research team potentially and working with more experienced researchers, and not necessarily worrying that you personally don't have enough experience to get into this. And then otherwise just having the general resources and capacity to perform study-related activities. So like they'll send someone out who looks and checks like, do you have a blood pressure cuff? Do you have a centrifuge? Do you have a, whatever is needed for that particular study? It's kind of just like a checklist. Like, can you do this with what you have right now? That said, sometimes you might not have the right equipment and you just tell them that. And if they're still interested in working with you, they will buy you the equipment. So especially some of these bigger sponsors, for the PONS trials, we did not have a Neurocom SOT machine, but Helios bought us one because we needed it to run that particular study. For another study, it required a lot of blood samples. We had never done blood sampling before, and so the sponsor company bought us all the equipment to set up a lab on site in order to do our blood sampling. So don't be afraid to ask. So here's my main take-home message, I think, right now for the Brainovation Network is that we have power in numbers. So this is a screenshot of the map of like the existing Brainovation partners right now. And we're out here on the West Coast with the clinical research experience, but we have access collectively to a lot of relevant geographies and access to diverse patients across North America. And as this network continues to grow, I think we should continue kind of having this shared resource attitude where if everybody is open to cross-referring and sharing their patients for research and sharing what research opportunities there are available. And our Center for Neurology Studies is kind of part of this, where we have a team that knows how to navigate this space and who's been doing this for a long time. We can work together and pitch this as something really attractive to these bigger sponsors. So the last chapter, part 3, is just how to do it yourself. So this is if you didn't want to partner with someone else and someone else's ideas, you've got your own idea and you want to do it that way. This is more the step-by-step guide. So step 1 in running your own research project is defining your questions. So I've got a few just primers to help guide your conversations and your thought process, if this is with a team or individually. Most of the time, if you're doing research, we're gonna force you to hone in on a single question. So not just like, does drug X work with Y population, but like, what's the one question you're trying to answer? So does PONS therapy improve balance in people with moderate Parkinson's? Really hone in on treatment, population, and outcome measure of interest. And from there, you can define your hypothesis on what you think is going to happen. You can also, though, have secondary or exploratory objectives. So in addition to measuring balance, you might also measure cognition and ask, when someone's balance improves, does that also correlate with an improvement in cognition? That would not necessarily be a pass-fail criteria of the protocol. Does PONS therapy improve balance? But it's an interesting question to ask as a secondary measure. What is the effect of PONS therapy on cognition? And exploratory, what is the correlation between improvements of balance and improvements in cognition? So from there, you define your hypothesis, and that kind of informs your stats plan. And it's really good practice to define your stats plan, write it down, and submit it to a public registry like clinicaltrials.gov in advance. This holds us credible so that at the end of the study, if the results show something different than what our hypothesis was, we don't go back and change it and say, well, actually, we thought that was going to happen. Think of what tools you will use to measure changes. So how are you going to measure balance? Do you have a very large neurocom SOT device in your clinic, or are you going to use something clinician evaluated like the BEST or the mini BEST, or are you going to use a new piece of technology? There's like phone-based, app-based, different sensor-based measures of balance. Or are you just going to ask the patient, how do you feel? Do you feel like your balance is better? Or how are you going to measure cognition? There's paper and pencil tests, there's digital cognitive tests, there's again self-report and clinician-based assessments like the MoCA, and then there's imaging and functional measurements like the NeuroCatch platform. Think about how long this study will take to run. So are you going to do 1 week of treatment, 1 month of treatment, 1 year of treatment? Do you want to follow patients up afterwards and see, does the treatment last longer after they've stopped? And how many patients do you think you'll need to recruit? So this really depends on your study design. If you're just looking at a case study, a case series, a proof of concept, or if you really want to prove out a hypothesis, then you're going to need to do a sample size analysis and pick a sample size that's big enough to find the signal in the noise of how much variability is expected in your outcome measures. What gaps are there in existing research or clinical guidelines? So if you're dealing with a complicated patient and you go to the literature to see like what is out there, what's available, and every paper says further research is needed or no research exists in this area, then you've got yourself a really good research question. And then importantly, is the question clinically meaningful? So if you're looking at like, does PONS therapy improve appetite in people with Parkinson's, when actually people with Parkinson's don't care about their appetite, then like it wouldn't really matter if even if you proved that it was. It's not necessarily a clinically meaningful question. So you want to make sure you're engaging patients and thinking about what would be important for them when you're designing your research questions. I'll just go back. I had that big slide earlier with a bunch of study designs. These are some of the like initial questions you can think about your study designs. One is prospective versus retrospective. So if you have been running a clinical practice for a long time and you have a database, you've been diligent in entering your data properly, doing good charting, good data collection, consistent outcome measures, you might be able to just look back at the evidence you already have and publish something versus a prospective study where you start fresh today and intervene or don't and measure how somebody's doing. So consider retrospective is often a lot cheaper. It's easier to get approved by an ethics board, but you do have to have pretty diligent clinical documentation in order to use your own data that way. You can also do retrospective based on like population data, like Stats Canada has a lot of available information. Your health authorities sometimes have a lot of really valuable information in their networks already. So lots of different ways to do retrospective studies. Similarly, observational versus interventional. So when you're doing an observational study, you're just watching to see what people do. So turns out we've got 5 clients who are coming into the clinic right now for amortal chamber use. They're doing it on their own accord. They've made their own decision to come in and do that. I'm just curious how they're doing. So you can kind of play with that a little bit and say, would you like to get your NeuroCatch done before and after so we can look at how your brain is doing, but we're not telling you to do amortal. We're just measuring how your brain is doing, knowing that you are doing amortal. Versus an interventional study is you must come to the clinic on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and use the amortal for 45 minutes each time because that is our study design and we're measuring the effect of the intervention. So similarly, observational studies are often a lot cheaper and easier to get through an ethics board because you're not introducing more risk into somebody's life, whereas interventional studies are kind of the full-blown, you're changing the course of someone's medical treatment, you're intervening in their life, so you're usually going for a full board ethics review at that point. Randomized blinded control trial, like I said, take a pill and wonder what you just took. You might have gotten a sugar pill, you might have gotten psilocybin, versus open label where everybody knows what they're getting. And sometimes it's impossible to have a control group, to have a true blinded control. So for our immortal study, we're going to have people lie down in the chamber without turning the chamber on, but everyone will know that the chamber's not on. And that's just the reality of the situation. You can't always blind when it's a table that vibrates. It's really hard to control for all of those factors. So in that case, we're doing an open label design where everybody knows what treatment they're getting. There's also the concept of real world evidence or program evaluation. So that ties back into that retrospective observational category, is that every day, like I said, as clinicians, you are generating evidence. And if you're good at writing that down, you can do program evaluation. Often just looking at your own program for areas of improvement, you don't even have to go through a research ethics board. If you don't want to publish and like change the direction of science, you just want to see, is my program working? And what can I do to improve my clinical program? You can do that all the time as like a mini form of real world evidence research. Evaluate, improve, which I would encourage everybody to do. Okay, so the next step, the sad reality is that research is time consuming and expensive. So you are going to have to find some funding most of the time to be able to do some research. So one question to ask yourself is, who would benefit from this research? Which groups or stakeholders would this be interesting to? Are you developing new intellectual property that might be appealing to an industry sponsor? Or is this more like patient benefit, where there may be groups like the MS Society of Canada or the Canadian Stroke Foundation, who their mission is to improve treatments for those particular populations? So the more stakeholders you get involved, and stakeholders are people who agree that that is a good research question to ask, it serves to strengthen your relationships and bolster the credibility of your research. Generally, with research, you can look into private funding, so industry funding or donors who have a specific interest in your project. There's grants and awards. There's many, many different kinds. Lots of big value grants come through the government. Most of those almost exclusively go to institutions, like like universities or health authorities. It's pretty tricky to get those large scale government grants as a private clinic. But there's also professional awards. So either your Canadian Physiotherapy Association or other governing body, they also have money to support you in doing research projects in your practice. And there's other organizations as well, a few examples listed here, that are worth looking into. If they don't have money this year, they might also be able to point you in the direction of other funding opportunities. So pro tip, go talk to your professional associations and ask them how to find funding. And then talk to researchers as well, because like I said, especially the academic researchers, they're grant hustlers. They are constantly keeping their eye on all the new grants that are coming up and what the criteria are. So reach out to them and see if they have any suggestions on ways you can either collaborate, or if they've just heard of something that you might be able to apply for. Step 3 is to educate yourself. So even though you're a clinician who works with humans every day, doing research with humans does require a little bit more certification and education. So there's a couple main categories. One is just in human subject protection and research ethics. In Canada, it's the certification is TCPS2. In the States, I can't remember the exact acronym, but it's human subject protection something. If you Google it, you'll find it, and I can send a link out afterwards. And then there's an international guideline called GCP, Good Clinical Practice, which ironically is about research, not clinical practice, even though it's called Good Clinical Practice. But that's kind of your gold standard for clinical research conduct. And that certification you need to renew every 3 years. You can also just consider attending local research meetings or webinars like this one, joining research associations to gain more exposure to this topic, because it's, I've been working in it for 16 years and I'm still learning a lot about it. Step 4 would be apply for Research Ethics Board approval. So most of the time, I think the one example that I gave where you wouldn't have to is if you're doing an internal program evaluation and you're not intervening in someone's life. But most of the time, if you're planning on publishing your findings or in any way intervening or doing anything different than you would normally do in your clinical practice, then you do need to go through Research Ethics Board approval. Some in the States, they call it an IRB. In Canada, we call it an REB. I don't know why we've decided to differentiate, but they're the same thing. Actually, in Europe, they call it an IEC, and International Ethics Committee. So yeah, it's all the same. A board of independent observers, and their big job is to make sure that the risks and the benefits balance out. So if you're putting someone at risk by giving them a new medication or exposing them to a new device, that the potential benefits, either to the individual or to the medical field as a whole, is balanced. Research ethics boards can be public. So all of your major universities and hospitals and health authorities will have an ethics board affiliated with them, and most of them require, if you're affiliated with them, they require you to go with that particular ethics board. Or private, sometimes we call them central IRBs or REBs, where it's a private company. They're great to work with because they meet much more frequently than your institutional ones do, but they often come with a higher cost. So the good part, if you or someone on your team is affiliated with a college or university, they might have a whole research department that's available to help you navigate this process at no cost. So do reach out if you have that resource available to you. Once you have your Research Ethics Board approval, you get to start collecting data. So this is kind of the fun part for some people, myself included. Just a few points on this. One is that informed consent, like documented written informed consent, is absolutely critical before any study-related activities are performed. Once you have a protocol that's been approved, you have to follow it strictly like a recipe. So always and only collect data as you've described in your protocol with participants who meet all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in your normal clinical practice, you have a lot more flexibility to make decisions on the fly and pivot and change. When you're working in research, you have to follow the protocol strictly and always. And then good documentation is critical. So even more than your regular clinical charting, if you're doing a bigger study, you might want to consider using software, an electronic data capture system, or EDC, that's been designed specifically for clinical research to make sure that this is done correctly and according to the regulations. In clinical research, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done, or it didn't happen. And we have a checklist for all the data that goes in. So everything that goes in has to be attributable. So who made that entry? It needs to be legible, obviously, easier in day of seeing patients, and at the end of the day, type out your charts and enter your data. And then also everything that is entered is tagged with a date and time stamp, so we can trace back and see when did that happen. Everything needs to be original, so not photocopies, not transcribed, like the original records, the source documents whenever you can find them. Accurate, of course, and then complete. So not leaving spaces empty, always filling in every single piece of your data collection checklist. So we go through this, we call it ALCOA C. We go through this checklist for clinical research documentation. Step 6 is to analyze and translate your findings. So like I said earlier, you've got your hypothesis. You start by testing your primary and secondary hypothesis like you planned to do at the beginning. So you don't just get to be like, yeah, we thought that was going to happen. You do have to go back and say, what did you think was going to happen at the beginning, and how does this compare to that? This part, like dealing with numbers and data and stats and manuscript writing, can be a little bit more daunting. But it can also be the most exciting part. It's kind of the grand reveal at the end. So you can kind of decide once you've looked at your results, is this something that I want to publish in a peer-reviewed journal as a manuscript? I could put out a white paper, I could do a webinar, I could do a grand rounds presentation at the local hospital. Kind of up to you how you want to translate and who you think is the best audience to hear it. If you don't already know how to do this part, there's other people in the world who love doing this. So I always outsource my statistics because I don't like doing statistics. I like looking at the results of statistics, but I don't like dealing with that. So I find a statistician who has dedicated their career to statistics, and they can do something in 1 hour that would take me a week. So I would highly encourage you to outsource the parts of research that you don't necessarily feel confident in, or that there's someone out there who can do a more efficient and accurate job. So if I could summarize all of this, all of what I've just said, into a few take-home points for you, I hope I've convinced you that research will elevate your clinical practice. Just by understanding study designs and how to gauge the quality of evidence can allow you as a clinician to make more evidence-informed clinicians on your own. Collaborating with researchers on existing projects is almost always a win-win situation for clinicians and researchers, and ultimately does help get new treatments developed faster. And if you want to do it yourself, conducting your own research is exciting and accessible, even if you've never done it before, and expert support is available. And then the other part, if you remember that map, and this is my future vision for the Brainovation Network, is that we're stronger together. So we don't need a research team at every single Brainovation clinic. We have a research team here, and we can help you navigate a lot of this. So that is all I have. I would say definitely reach out to me. My email is here. If you'd like to refer a patient, if you'd like to consider being a satellite site for some of the work that we have going on right now at the CNS, or if you have your own ideas and you want to pitch a study, we'd be happy to work with you. Thank you.
That's great. Oh, Marcus, do you have a question for Sonia?
Yeah, I don't want to jump in right off the bat if somebody else has an urgent one, because I know we've only got about 10 minutes or so.
No, you go ahead.
That was great, Sonia. Thank you. Just a few little things. So far, we've been part of one study that has significant funding attached to it. Another we've been asked to participate in. And it's funny how the trickle-down effect for the funding piece doesn't seem to make its way to the clinic. In other words, we're often asked to sign in-kind contracts. And I just wonder if you could comment on that. Not that we're unhappy doing that, but as a private clinic, there's obviously costs added with the admin piece, with all the time commitments that doesn't get compensated. And I wonder if you could speak to that point.
Yeah, is this a grant funded or industry funded?
It was a grant funded, and I guess the addition of our clinic came late in the game, and so I guess it wasn't budgeted initially. That was the understanding I was given, or a lot of people come in and say, yeah, we've got lots of money, we'd love to be involved. And then when the contract comes through, it's like in-kind commitment for 7 years kind of thing. We just had one from University of Ottawa. Please sign this in-kind. And they come around saying, we got this massive grant, but then can you put yours in kind, right?
Yeah, I could talk about this for a long time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's particularly for public institution grants, they almost always have a clause in them that says the grant can't go towards paying the investigator if the investigator has any kind of research appointment. So if you're affiliated with an institution and the institution is hypothetically paying you in some way to contribute to research, then the grant can't go to you. So it's really common for grants to say investigators don't. And frequently grants don't have a specific line for overhead. So rather than just saying, 20% of this grant goes towards keeping my clinic lights on, there's other ways of changing your budget, basically making other line items higher and listing out more things like equipment and software and whatever it might be that's nursing time, technician time, room rental rates, laundry service, like everything that's costing you money, listing them out as individual line items, because we don't get to just say overhead. So that kind of helps to cover some of it. But yeah, my general, if I could get on my pedestal and rant about this whole industry, it's that the people doing the research these are like the kindest hearted, best people in the world. And we are the ones getting the least amount of money and the least amount of like financial gain at the end of it. So, the sponsor company at the end, and this is more for industry, they get the intellectual property and the patent, and they're going to get rich, ideally, if they have good results. The contract research organization gets paid a very large amount from the sponsor company, and their goal is to actually make sure that the sites get as little as possible. So if you're not good at asking for every single thing that you're gonna, and most people don't know until
Yes.
they're, 1 year into the project, how much it's gonna cost to do something, then you just get hooped and they say, well, you've already signed the contract and we just want the research to finish, and it's unethical to just stop the research because of money. So we keep going and we run at a deficit. And I have a lot of
Wow.
feelings about that. I share your frustration.
Well, thank you, because I thought I was an outlier in that regard. I mean, I'm not very
Oh,
good at asking for things, but yeah.
yeah, no, that it's really common. I was just at a clinical research conference in Florida, focused on sites. So it's kind of the Global Society for Clinical Research Sites, and they have these sessions on like hidden costs in budgeting and how to make your site profitable. And it's amazing the amount of frustrated people who sit in those rooms saying like, I'm working so hard and I'm not profitable. Like
Wow.
my business is not working the way I want it
Yeah.
to. So
Wow.
it's sad, but it's kind of nice to know that we're not
Yeah.
alone in that,
Okay.
but it's a really common problem in the industry.
Well, maybe we could have a sidebar, another follow-up to this one, because I think of all the impediments that are going to prevent people from signing on or joining this, the questions are there, the clinical interest is there, all that stuff, everything you've outlined. But that's where the shoe drops, I think, is when people say, wait a second, I'm going to do all this extra work
Yeah.
on my own time and on my own dime. I mean, it's wonderful to be passionate about something, but it only goes so far, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel you.
Well, thank you. The second thing was with regards to mining data. So we've got about 200 neurocatch assessments out there, and I populate, a lot of the subjective stuff in the small clinical box that we have. And I don't know if the AI or anything was able to mine, even if it were possible, a certain question like, does the P300, for instance, correlate with PTSD hypervigilance slash? And would one be able to go retrospectively, or do you now need ethics or approval from each one of those individual patients whose data you're mining, unbeknownst to them, to get a collective question answered?
There's two parts to that question. For the first part, if for PTSD hypervigilance, something that specific in wording, you would need to make sure that all of your pre-scan surveys have been done accurately, and you've always said PTSD hypervigilance when you've entered that at the beginning, because if they don't have that tagged, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, you wouldn't be able to find it and you wouldn't know. But if there is a way to tie those two together, most of the time for retrospective observational studies, you can get a waiver of consent. So if you plan on publishing, you do need to go through an ethics board, but you don't need to go back to hundreds of patients who have had neurocatch scans and say, just so you know, I'm looking at your data. Because once you've gotten to that retrospective observational and you describe how you're going to de-identify the data and how no one will know who this person is, if you've got a good plan for kind of that anonymous use of data, the ethics board will agree and grant you the waiver of consent. That says you don't need to ask every single individual for their permission to use their data in that way.
Would you know, just from a technical perspective, whether that would be possible? Like, can you amalgamate the sort of verbal data that's been entered into the clinical information box and the neurocatch scan results and have AI kind of do an analysis and see how many times hypervigilance, PTSD, certain keywords show up in a scan that has a P300 over a certain threshold?
Yeah, I think this is, again, something that I would outsource personally, but that seems very doable. Like I said, as long as the search terms are in the data set, like you can find PTSD diagnosis, hypervigilance diagnosis, and that can tie to the scan that was done, then it should be very easy to just set the threshold. Show me everyone with this term and this P300 threshold above or below.
Okay. Brilliant. I think that's it. But yeah, so that in-kind contract for 7 years, I should really question, because that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, particularly since it always comes in the door as saying, wow, we've got this really great grant and would you like to join us? And this great idea. But then when the contract time comes around, that was never discussed, that this was supposed to be in kind, right?
And the other frustrating thing about that is that the institution can charge overhead. So when you win the grant, sometimes 40% of your grant goes to the institution for their overhead.
Exactly.
But then you, as your private clinic, your overhead is discounted or not counted.
Yeah.
And that's that's really frustrating.
I would suggest a follow-up on this particular session, because if you're going to loop more people into doing this in private clinics, that question has to be answered.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. That was great.
Orla, do you
minute.
have any questions?
I don't. I was just listening to Marcus about the funding side of things. I mean, that is the biggest thing, or the biggest drawback for me as well, would be the funding. And I certainly don't have the capability of doing something in kind. I would need to make sure that my clinicians are paid for if they're going to do any sort of investigations. I do, and we have done one big randomized control trial with a company sponsor. And that sponsorship came directly to us. So we were able to pay, as a randomized controlled trial, we were able to pay our investigators through that. And we made sure the budget was round enough for our own expenses. That's definitely one way I would go again, is to do that type of trial, because then I have control of the budget, and, we don't have to go through any of these other third parties where you wouldn't actually get the funding. But I do want to try and do a couple of other, particularly as a clinician, to try and do a couple of other trials in here, but using the universities and the grad students to do that, just to better my own practice. But if I'm going to be involved in anything, I would probably go towards a company to actually pay for the tech, or pay for the investigators somehow. Because we went totally independent. We didn't go through any university. We used Advara for ethics, and we did do clinical gov, and we've done all of that, but we stayed away from the universities.
Yeah,
Because the
yeah,
budget.
I'm very happy to help with any of those just budgeting questions, and like, what am I missing, or how do I make sure that we're going to get paid for this work, or in advance? Because a lot of times once you've signed the contract, it's very hard to go back.
Yeah, I know that there are government funding sources out there as well. It's a lot of work to actually get those funding proposals in.
Oh yeah, ton of work.
And that's where I'm kind of saying, while I want to do that and I want to have control of the budget, it's like, I don't want to be putting in that work, because it's a lot of work
I feel
to get those grants. Yeah. So if anybody has any other suggestions, then let me know.
There are some grant writing companies that will, they're professional grant writers. They do it all the time. Often their funding model is, if you find a good one, I wouldn't pay someone, well, I don't know, it depends. If you're really confident that you're going to have a good grant, or if it's something you were going to do anyways and you just don't have time, then paying someone by the hour makes sense, because you're just kind of outsourcing that effort that you would otherwise have to take on. There are companies that do grant writing, and often they'll take a percentage if you win, and they're confident in their success rate because they do this so often. So between usually 10 and 20% of the grant goes to the granting agency if you win. But if you don't win, you don't have to pay them anything. That's an option sometimes, although it's tricky, again, in the same way that you can't put overhead in your budget. A lot of times it's hard to account for the fact that 10 to 20% is already going to go to that granting consulting firm, where you can't write that into your grant. So because the grant needs to sound like it's coming from you, not from this other company. So it's a little bit tricky, but with some creative budgeting, I've known other people who have done that.
Right. Okay.
Well,
Okay.
thank you so much, Sonia, for this great informational session. I learned a lot, that's for sure. So it will be recorded, and then Tanya will give me the go ahead, and I will upload it. So if you need to view it again. And then also, if you want Sonia's information, contact information, and you didn't get it off the last slide and it hasn't been uploaded yet, but you're dying to talk to her, she's given us permission, I can give you her contact information and you can reach out to her directly.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Super.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Well done.